In this video, I'm going to talk about evaluating coverage amounts for disability income insurance. As a general rule of thumb, typically, it's recommended that people aim to replace 60 to 70% of gross income when purchasing disability income insurance. Now, we need to kind of discuss a little bit kind of what's happening with that and why people are aiming at 60 to 70% and so forth. So first off, one of the things to think about when evaluating how much should be replaced with disability income insurance should a disability occur, some expenses are going to change with the disability. So if a person becomes disabled, then that person may need assistance doing everyday daily tasks such as helping them eat, helping them bathe themselves. Those sorts of things could possibly lead to some significant additional expenses. So some expenses would change with disability. Even if you didn't have those expenses, but we had a situation in which a person now has to have, maybe some kind of special shoes or something like that due to a foot or leg injury, that could lead to more expenses that were not previously existing. Now, importantly, and this kind of relates to the 60 to 70% of gross income aspect of things, disability income is tax-free. So if you think about replacing a dollar of pre-tax income, then the person doesn't really need to replace that on a dollar for dollar basis. And the reason why the person doesn't need to replace that on a dollar for dollar basis is if the person had a dollar of pre-tax income and then paid, say, 20% in federal, local, and state taxes, then really out of that dollar of pre-tax income, they were only walking away with, say, 80% of it. So from that standpoint, if you're not getting taxed on the disability income, then it makes sense that you don't need as much. So you could perhaps the 60 or 70% replacement starts to make a bit more sense. Now, when evaluating that, it's also possible that there could be other circumstances that might require more coverage. So if a person was looking at family circumstances and they were expecting certain things to be, kind of progressively more expensive in the future, maybe there's another child on the way, things like that could be expected to lead to higher levels of expenses going forward, or things of that nature. Or perhaps the person is helping to care for somebody in the family that has a disability. So then if the person became disabled and was unable to work, then now we need help not only for the former wage earner, but also whoever that person was helping. So, there could be some circumstances that could indicate that a higher level of coverage would make sense. However, there is what's called a moral hazard problem here. And basically, a moral hazard problem is essentially coming from economics. And the issue here is that we could create a situation in which a person would have an incentive to, in effect, engage in kind of bad behavior. So, for instance, let's suppose a person had disability income insurance that covered 100% of their 100% of their income. Well, unfortunately, there are some people who would possibly start looking at that and start thinking about, so I'm doing all this work, and if I just happen to be disabled in some way that I was not able to do the work, I would actually walk away with just as much money and not have to do the work. And unfortunately, there are some people in this world that would actually start thinking like that. And they would start thinking about what kind of minimum level of disability would qualify them for that. And so that's the idea behind kind of the moral hazard. If full replacement was in place, or even worse, if a person had purchased more disability income insurance than the income that they had, let's say you had $75,000 of income a year, and you purchased disability income insurance that covered $100,000 of income a year. Well, my goodness, if that's the case, then I actually make more money if I become disabled, right? So obviously that would be a problem. So and people would try to exploit that, unfortunately. So to address that, there are typically coverage limits that across the different disability income insurance policies, cumulatively only a certain amount will be covered. Basically, and generally you can't get disability income insurance even across multiple policies. You can't get it in excess of what your income was. generally speaking. So, and the point of that is to basically try to remove somebody from having that incentive, or remove that incentive from somebody to engage in kind of bad behavior with that. Now, typically the group coverage plans that are offered through employers are generally limited. So they're generally, they may only kick in after a certain length of time. They may only cover up to a certain limited amount of income. And so typically that's what's going to be available through an employer. Now, sometimes there may be other coverage that can be purchased in addition to sort of what the employer may be already offering. So you may be able to essentially pay more and have more deductions and things like that from your paycheck to purchase additional coverage. That varies a bit from employer to employer, but that's something worth evaluating for an individual situation. Importantly, if you're thinking that Social Security disability coverage is going to take care of things you don't need to worry about it, the reality is Social Security disability coverage is likely far, far, far too low. Because unless you were starting from an incredibly low income level and you really didn't have any income to speak of anyway, very little, the reality is it's just not going to replace nearly enough for most people. And unless you're in some kind of an interesting situation in the family where you're earning a good amount of money, but you don't really need any of it, in which case, congratulations to you. That's fantastic. But if that was the case, then maybe Social Security would be fine because you don't really need any of the income anyway. But the reality is if you're like everybody else and you need your income, the disability coverage from Social Security it's a starting point. It's going to help, but it's not going to replace everything. So that's something to be mindful of. The term of coverage. So short-term disability coverage is generally going to be considered kind of 1 to 2 years. So if you're disabled for 1 to 2 years or somewhere in that range, typically, that's going to be considered short-term disability coverage. If you are looking at a period longer than that, that's long-term disability coverage, and that's only going to kick in after the short-term disability, and then it would continue on long-term. So that actually brings up an interesting issue as it relates to the role of savings in this estimation. So if you have a significant level of savings that you could completely pay all your bills and everything else for the next year, which would be an amazing level of savings. Little side note, because I can't resist pointing it out, a good target to aim for would be to have 3 to 6 months worth of expenses. So 3 to 6 months worth of expenses set aside in savings for emergency kinds of situations. It's a good goal to aim for. It could take a long time to get there, but it's a good goal to aim for. So if you had a really good level of savings, then in that case, you may not need nearly as much short-term disability coverage because you have savings to help tide you over until long-term disability would kick in. So kind of the more savings you have, probably the less coverage that you need on the short-term side. But the reality is, if you're earning the primary income for the family or your family is depending upon your income, long-term disability insurance starts looking really important in most cases, due to the fact that the savings just would not cover forever, obviously. So that's something to kind of think about when evaluating the kinds of coverage that a person has. Hopefully this video helps. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.